behavioral health support. The topic is trauma-informed care, cultural competence, internalized racism, and it's presented by Jules Martinez, who is an LCSW and CPSS. They are the clinical director at Latino Behavioral Health Services, as well as the co-founder of LBHS. They work with, as a therapist with Latinx youth and young adults, and as a supervisor to a team of therapists and peer mentors. Jules is a person in long-term recovery who, after a decade of learning through music, art, farming, travel, and other experiences, returned to school to pursue a career in the mental health field. They have been deeply involved in the peer movement, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts in the behavioral healthcare system for a decade. I'll let Jules take it from here.
Thanks so much, Kate. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. As Kate mentioned, my name's Jules, and I'm here to present to you all today. With this being a somewhat small group, I would love it if you all just want to chime in with questions. Feel free to raise your hand or just unmute yourself and we can have a discussion. Sometimes these topics can be a little bit hard to hear about and talk about, and so it's really nice to have a small group where we can talk things through if we need to. So feel free to chime in. So today, I'm from Latino Behavioral Health Services. I'm pretty sure Kate said that. Today we have a lot of objectives in here, so we're gonna jam through a lot of content, but hopefully to do it in a meaningful way. We're gonna talk about trauma and talk about the impact of trauma, including with the way different cultural groups experience trauma. And within that, we're going to talk about racism and internalized racism as trauma and the way that that impacts people. We'll talk about trauma-informed care and cultural humility and cultural responsiveness as part of trauma-informed care. And then I hope to be able to, especially since this is a small group, we can talk together about how to start integrating a trauma-informed approach with a culturally responsive lens to help address trauma in our communities, including racism and internalized racism. Any questions or thoughts about the objectives before we jump in? No. Okay. So what is trauma? I'm going to ask you guys, I'm going to ask you all to participate a little bit with me. I don't know what your roles are at Moab Free Health Clinic or within the ECHO grant. Are you all familiar with this theme already?
I would say on a general level, yes.
Okay, so we're not talking to therapists specifically. Okay, so what is trauma? Trauma, thank you for letting me know that, Julianne. Trauma, as we talk about it in therapy, we can all experience traumatic events in our life. Most of us have experienced traumatic events in our lives when we're children and throughout the lifespan. Essentially, something traumatic is something terrible that happens to us. These are all the terrible things that we go through as human beings that involve violence or death or really difficult circumstances in relationships. This can include child abuse and neglect, sexual abuse and sexual violence, traumatic accidents, medical trauma, traumatic grief, so losing someone that you care about. Those are kind of the capital T trauma things that we talk about as therapists, some of the major ones. But trauma can also be a more kind of commonplace, less like acute violent experience and more of an ongoing experience that creates problems for us. And these include bullying, living in a community where there's a lot of violence, being involved in or witnessing domestic violence, war, terrorism, and displacement. Structural violence, so that refers to racism and the other isms, natural disasters, the impact of poverty, and other things go in here too. Having caregivers who are using substances or in and out of jail. The list is really long. And what we know about experiencing these events is that they have a really big impact on our physical and emotional health. And generally, the more events that we experience, these traumatic events stack for us. So how do they stack? Oops, I want to go back. What we know, there's been a ton of research on, have you guys heard of the ACEs study? Has anyone heard of that? So there's this really epic study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. Okay, you guys have all heard of that. About the impact of traumatic events on children. And this study has followed hundreds of children throughout their life into adulthood and beyond. And the impact of trauma, not only on our mental health, so folks who experience 4 or more ACEs growing up are more likely to have mental health challenges, substance use challenges, but also on our life course and our physical health. So folks who experience a lot of ACEs are less likely to graduate high school, statistically have a lower income, are more likely to be incarcerated, to experience homelessness, but also to have things like chronic health problems like diabetes, immune diseases, heart diseases like high blood pressure and things like that. So the impact on our bodies and on our well-being is really profound. And I also have to say that not everybody who experiences traumatic events has mental health challenges or physical health challenges later in life. A lot of folks have a lot of resilience, and there's a lot of things that we can do to overcome trauma, and a lot of internal qualities and resources in our lives and family and community that help us overcome these things. So a lot of folks, when we look at this list, most of us will say, dang, I've experienced 5 of those or 2 of those or 10 of those. And I want to make sure, that can be kind of hard to see and hear, but I want to make sure that everyone knows that the statistics I'm sharing aren't necessarily true for everyone, and that we can all overcome trauma. There's this other experience of trauma that a lot of us as providers, whether that's in healthcare systems, in DCFS, working as teachers, and as therapists, we experience what's called secondary trauma. So secondary trauma is something that happens when we hear about or talk about or witness the traumatic experiences of other folks. And sometimes as a therapist, for example, when we listen to, people talk about all the most difficult experiences in their life for 6 or 8 hours a day, it can start to feel pretty heavy if we're just focusing on that. And it can impact the way that we think about ourselves and the world, the trustworthiness of humans and the goodness of the world. And so we have to be really careful about balancing those experiences of secondary trauma. So complex trauma is another type of trauma. And this is when these experiences start to stack over time. So when we're exposed to multiple traumatic events, and sometimes we talk about relational trauma in this way or interpersonal trauma. So for example, when we're raised in a household where we experience a lot of emotional abuse over a long term, or we witness domestic violence over a long term, or community violence, those things really affect the way that we think about the world. And our bodies carry that stress, and that can have some of the same long-term effects. Any questions so far? Okay. So intergenerational trauma is another way to talk about trauma or understand trauma and the way that it's passed down from one generation to another. So there's this really cool research coming out in the last 10, 15 years about what's called epigenetics. And when we experience traumatic stress, it affects the way that our genetic code is expressed. And this has to do with some of the biological changes and the disease that we see later in life for folks who experience a lot of trauma. But that also impacts our gametes, to get really scientific with you all. So the way that we produce children and the way that our genetic material is passed down carries some of those changes that we experience from trauma. And it also carries, if we heal from trauma, that can be passed down as well. So there's this cool biological research coming out recently to kind of back this up, but a lot of communities of color have talked about this and known about this for many decades, that the way that we experience the world is something that we teach and pass down to our children, and that our children learn from us. And a lot of times this comes from experiences of war and terrorism and displacement, but also things like racism and other kind of isms. When one community is really suffering from systemic oppression, that trickles down through the generations and has a cumulative effect. Questions about this? This is kind of maybe a newer concept for folks. Have you guys all heard about intergenerational trauma?
So if it's in your like biology, is breaking the cycle of that a lot more difficult?
I think that it's the same. I think intergenerational trauma is more difficult to heal from than an acute, capital T trauma. I was bit by a dog when I was a kid, because it's part of our everyday lives and our everyday social fabric. It's not just, so to give you an example, if we talk about the intergenerational trauma that Latino immigrants experience, for example, a lot of the clients that I work with are young people, teens, who are being raised as bicultural, and they might be going through their own traumatic experiences, but their parents went through a lot of traumatic experiences, and their parents did, because the way that oppression has worked in Mexico, for example, around poverty and not being able to access jobs. Folks didn't get as much attention in their childhood emotionally. They didn't get as much nutrition. They were raised within a cultural framework that maybe, the roles of women were to be subservient and serve their families and take care of their families in a certain way. And part of that also means that sometimes there's a lot of domestic violence happening, where male partners can be abusive in some ways. And so women fleeing that situation and come to the United States transmit these cultural ideas that maybe men are dangerous and scary, and maybe women need to be subservient. And so all of that biological, cultural, social learning kind of snowballs, and it's a lot to unpack and unravel and unlearn, not just like an acute incident that happened where I was bit by a dog as a kid. And people are, unraveling and unpacking this and healing from it all of the time.
I love the healing portion.
Yeah,
Too.
where, because of being in a community that has more awareness, more resources around some of this, women become empowered to start, taking control of their own lives, and are teaching that to their children. And the way that the stress around all of those factors is moderated in our body is also passed down. So,
Wow, thanks for elaborating.
for unborn kids. Let's see. Yeah, it's really cool that healing can be passed on, and not just stress, for sure. So intergenerational trauma is kind of nestled within historical trauma. So multi-generational trauma experienced by a whole cultural group, oftentimes a racial or ethnic group in the United States. For example, we could talk about slavery and the way that that impacted an entire racial group and the way that that is still felt in our structures and systems, but also in the bodies of Black and Brown folks. The Holocaust is another great example of this, where this was a whole community across several nations of Jewish people who felt the effects of this oppression and still do. Forced migration, especially related to the colonization of Native Americans in the US and in all of the Americas, but also in other places related to climate change and war and different reasons. So this is perhaps the most difficult kind of trauma to heal from. As you can see, these things sort of get more complex and stacked as we go through. And this, I think, healing from historical trauma takes more community-based work and systemic work in changing things on that level. So as we've kind of alluded to in the last few slides, racism and internalized racism really fit within the context of traumatic experiences that many communities and people experience. So we have this kind of structural racism, which happens, for example, in the way that people and policies stack together. For example, with the colonization of the Americas, there were policies in process that allowed European settlers to take land from Native peoples. And the attitudes and beliefs that went around with that created interactions between white folks and Native Americans. That's the interpersonal piece. And there were these institutional pieces, the laws and structures that allowed a lot of this to happen. And then a lot of times folks from communities of color internalize that experience of racism, especially growing up in it from childhood, where the belief that one group is superior and one is inferior, all of the interpersonal interactions, all of the policies, the things that happen to a person in their life, it's hard not to believe that and internalize that. And that can be extremely traumatic and difficult to heal from as well. So these things all interact and kind of feed on each other. And again, I like to really hit the strengths-based pieces and the healing pieces, but this can go in the other direction too, where if we do our own internal work to become educated and to heal from these experiences, we're more likely to have healthy interpersonal reactions that, have less microaggressions, or where people of color are, feel empowered to in a certain interaction, and where policies and procedures support equity as well. And all of that stacks up to be structurally a more healthy place. Questions about this? This is really tough, you guys. I want to share with you a story about some research that was done in the 70s. Maybe research was done a little more loosely back then, but also we have some really illuminating research where little kids, 4, 5, 6 years old, were given the choice to play with white baby dolls or with Black baby dolls. And almost all of the kids, no matter what race they were, chose white baby dolls. And that just kind of as an example of the feeling of one race being superior, that's taught in all of the images that we see in the commercials, in the interpersonal interactions, and how that feels for people of color who live in a Black body, who grew up with all of those experiences. It's really heavy. And a lot of times folks, don't feel like they belong in school, in college, or to be in the position of a boss at a company. There's something called imposter syndrome, where there's just a lot of discomfort around that, and it takes a lot of work to heal from. So as we move forward with this, I want to really talk about when we teach about equity, inclusion, and diversity, equity, inclusion, access. We're oftentimes teaching to folks who come from privileged identities about cultural humility and learning about other cultures and learning about equity. But for folks who come from these communities who have been oppressed, I think the work is really about healing and overcoming a lot of those experiences and finding ways to rest and take care and connect. So I want to speak to that side too. Thoughts or questions about this before we go forward? This is a lot to hit you with all at once, you guys, over lunch. I apologize.
Have they redone that 70s study?
I'm not sure.
I'm just curious if it's different since, I mean, as a society, I feel like we haven't gotten much better, but at least there's a little bit more inclusion, I think, in at least the toy section of the stores.
Yeah. Yeah, incrementally. I think the research that I've seen more recently, Kate, is like the Harvard implicit bias studies. This is a test that you guys can all go take for free, and it will probably blow your mind. But most of us who do these implicit bias tests, we will end up preferring having a preference for white bodies and faces, even folks of color. So that's not true across the board, and maybe it has gotten better, but it's definitely still a thing.
So is that the Harvard Implicit Association test?
Yes. Yeah. And they have them for race and gender and ability and sexuality and different things. So those are pretty cool way to kind of self-assess what some of our implicit biases might be.
And it might be a staff activity to all take the test.
Yeah, get ready for a fun debrief after that. Okay. So we talked about this a little bit. All these traumatic experiences look different across the lifespan. This bullet list on the left is a pretty clinical description of what therapists or psychologists might identify trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder. So having intrusive thoughts or memories or dreams about the traumatic events that happened, but at the same time, you're trying not to think about those things. And that takes a lot of energy trying to manage those thoughts. And so it can be really difficult to concentrate, to think things through, to make decisions. And a lot of times we'll have negative changes in the way we think about ourselves and the world. So our self-esteem might be lower. We might think other people are not good people or not trustworthy or not capable of caring for us. Or just in general that the world is not a safe place. Just as some examples, we might experience more sadness, more anger, more guilt, more shame. Thank you, Kate, for putting that in the chat. Hypervigilance essentially is just looking around the world, kind of waiting for all the bad things to happen, feeling as if you have to be on guard all the time to protect yourself. Isolating from others, sleeping too much, sleeping not enough, having a lot more stomach aches and headaches and aches and pains in our bodies. And then in teens, teens are so special. They get to have all the things. So symptoms in teens could look really similar to adults or really similar to kids. But because of the special kind of developmental place that teens are in, it could also include a lot more reckless behavior or self-destructive behavior or disruptive behavior at home or in school. And then in little kids, they can, if they've gained milestones and then experienced traumatic events, they'll sometimes regress in the way that suddenly they're not as verbal as they used to be. They used to be potty trained, but now they're wetting the bed or having accidents at school, things like that. They'll want to sometimes act out what's happened to them during play, which can be really scary for adults to see. They might be extra clingy or they might isolate. They could have nightmares as well. And kind of a reduced spatial awareness. So as a way to kind of protect, especially for kids who've experienced physical violence or physical abuse, they might kind of check out of their body. And so they'll be bumping into things, having a lot of accidents, things like that. So this is kind of the short term. And we talked about long term, kind of these things stay in our body. And we're more likely to have, physical illness and disease, things like smoking, drinking, drug use, all of those things. This is an amazing book. If any of you it's really difficult emotionally to read, but it's does an incredible job of integrating science and research with clinical experience and lived experience. It's really well done. If anyone has the time, that's a great read. So this kind of calls back to the way that these traumatic experiences nestle and get more complex in different settings. Almost all of us, 61% of adults have experienced at least one adverse experience in childhood, but almost all of us will experience some kind of traumatic event in our lifetimes. Folks with marginalized identities, so women, people of color, poor people, immigrants and refugees, people from the LGBT community, kind of all of those communities who experience oppression are more likely to experience more traumatic events in their lifetimes. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit here and talk about a few different cultural groups, kind of general experiences of and responses to trauma. But before I do, I want to just kind of, as a footnote, we're talking about cultural groups in a generalized way moving forward through the next few slides. And there is so much diversity within all of these groups. For example, I work in the Latino community, and the bicultural kids that I work with who are Latino have a totally different experience of and response to trauma than their parents who immigrated here. And their parents who immigrated here, some are from Chile, some are from Venezuela, some are from Peru, some are from Mexico, and all of those lenses are different. And by age groups, by gender, I just want to point out we're going to generalize a little bit here, but all of this is so variable. So that's why this learning is never done. And we're just slamming through this in an hour, but it's really something that we have to take a lot of time to understand the nuances of these things. So any questions so far about trauma, the impact of trauma, different types of trauma, including racism? Any reactions? How are you all feeling? This kind of training, I got to tell you guys, it's hard to do online with y'all cameras off. I don't know how you're feeling, it's a heavy topic. Guys doing okay? All right. Okay, so I want to start with the Latinx community, the Latina community. This is where I work and spend most of my time. So when we talk about historical and intergenerational trauma, the Latinx community has a history of colonization, starting, for the last 500 years. And that has created a lot of trauma. And that's something that folks still experience in our structures and our systems and our policies, as well as in our bodies. And I say our, but I'm not Latina, but colonization had a big impact on the Latina community. And it continues to, and through political violence, economic oppression that creates poverty and community violence and migration and all of the traumatic experiences that come in the process of migration and in the process of acculturation that people go through. It's a really difficult and traumatic process in and of itself. 75% of migrants from Latin America to the US report histories of trauma. So not including the process of trauma, but both the reasons that they immigrated, likely around poverty and violence. And so this community in the US, the Latinx community, has a lot that they're processing and going through. And I want to, again, focus on the strengths and values of this community that are helping them overcome this trauma and get through it. There's such an incredible strength and resilience in the Latino community. Folks are so hardworking in general and strong, and they care so much about their families. On the right here, we have this word familismo, but there's so much strength in Latino families and the way that they care for one another and connect with one another, from the food that they share to the time that they spend. It's really something that I admire and that helps people overcome and manage the difficult experiences that they're going through. Personalismo. This is one of my favorite things about the Latino community where I come to work, and everybody gives kisses and hugs. Everybody's so kind to each other. They ask about how their families are doing and, talk about the food that they're sharing. And there's I want to say politeness, but it goes beyond politeness. There's this warmth that's really important to the community. That's really positive and strength-based and helps folks connect. And connection is one of the really important ways that we overcome trauma with ourselves, with our bodies, with other people, with the world around us. And so personalismo is a really amazing strength. Confianza is a trust. So this is kind of connected to familismo and personalismo. It's like the trust that we have within families and homes. If I invite you into my home, you're one of us now. You're having dinner with us. You're sharing space with us. And again, there's this connection. And then it's not repeto, it's respeto. That's a typo. I apologize. So the way that we respect each other, especially, we respect our elders and different kind of roles within households and society. And this is a way that folks create kind of like order and seek advice and support from one another in these different structures of respeto. And dignidad. So sometimes this is hard where we feel like we have to show up and put on a brave face and be happy and be strong, but it's also something that really helps folks overcome and get through hard times, to be able to kind of show your best face to the world. Comments about any of this?
I love that you mentioned the cultural strengths and values. I feel like that's important in terms of talking about strengths in addition to all of the oppression and
Mhm.
And what
Totally.
I really
And
like about the cultural strengths and values too, I've experienced some of that and I didn't realize that that was like more of a thing that happens. Like that's just really cool to learn like that, that I've been able to experience some of that. So
it's a
Yeah,
lovely picture.
it makes me reconsider my own interactions, um, especially people from this background.
Yeah, white people are seen as pretty dry, pretty not friendly, and
Yeah.
like all we care about is work, and we're very independent and just maybe selfish sometimes is the way that that's perceived, and um, maybe undignified sometimes in the way that we present ourselves, and that we don't have as much respect for our elders, especially. Um, so it's just again, it's just differences, right? We have different cultural values, white European folks, and so it's something to be aware of.
Yeah, and I
But
feel like strengths and values, they all make me feel better when I'm around um, people from this culture.
mhm,
So maybe good to incorporate some of them into my own.
yeah, in a way that feels authentic and true for you.
Mhm.
Yeah. And the reason I focus on strengths and values, when we talk about trauma, when we talk about secondary trauma, when we talk about intergenerational, historic, internalized racism, I feel like focusing on strengths and leaning into our values is one way that we can really overcome traumatic experiences from a clinical perspective. But also as a clinician, if I'm always bogged down in thinking about the terrible things that have happened to the people I'm working with, it's traumatic for me in a secondary trauma kind of way. But if I can focus on the strengths and the resilience of the people I'm working with, it's a whole different experience. And it's a different experience for them. And, for folks trying to overcome internalized racism, internalized oppression, this is also hugely helpful to be able to focus when people identify with their racial and ethnic identity and they can connect with those values and have pride in them. Statistically, again, they have a lot more resilience and a lot better outcomes in their life than folks who try to kind of push that away. Or I have kids. I'm a therapist for teens who don't want to spend time outside because they don't want to be so brown. They want to have more white skin. Who depict themselves in their stories and their art as white-bodied. And it's really sad. I really, because the internal experience of that is one of shame and pushing away and devaluing parts of themselves that they'll never be able to push away. That's part of who they are. And so helping them connect with that, find strength in it and value in it, is a really healing process. I got carried away on a tangent and now I'm way behind. I'm gonna just jump through. Carissa, did you have something you want to add?
so say thank you for sharing that. That's very powerful. And that was just thanks for sharing that
Yeah.
about the kids. I work with a lot of kids and yeah, just thanks.
Mhm. So the African American community, I don't have as much experience working with the African American or Black community, um, but they also have a history of deep historic intergenerational trauma and the day-to-day experiences of racism and trauma that folks from this community experience still today, including colonization, slavery, the dehumanization that went along with slavery, and segregation, ongoing racism and discrimination, including policing. There's a lot of fear of systems and structures in this community for good reason. And some of the things that help this community get through those traumatic experiences and thrive. Again, we see in a lot of communities of color this value of family. And I think in the Black community, this extends to community and especially to religion. I think in the context of segregation and slavery, churches were a place where Black people could be themselves could connect with each other and didn't have to deal with oppression and discrimination and racism. And so religion and church continues to be, for a lot of folks, again, there's so much variation here, but a place of strength for folks. There's a big value of elders teaching younger folks, not just mothers and fathers, but grandmothers, aunts and uncles, and just kind of younger people in the community where there's this, support across generations. And then increasingly, a lot of folks find a lot of strength in connecting with their racial identity and their roots. I'm going to jam through these as quickly as I can, you guys. Indigenous communities, and again, there's so much variation in these communities, but also have this history of oppression, of violence, of relocation, of forced assimilation, genocide, a lot of mistrust with American systems, government systems, with medical systems because of the systematic oppression that they've experienced, including in medical systems. And again, we see some similar values here in connectedness and collectivism. It doesn't necessarily center so much on family, but extends to community, to tribes. A lot of Indigenous communities have a really rich traditions in spirituality and healing and shamans and storytelling. And the role that elders hold within all of that and the way that those elements interact is a really rich, beautiful space for healing as well. We have a lot, I should say as a white person, my community has a lot to learn from these communities. So this is the best part, and I'm trying to integrate this throughout, but how many of you have heard of trauma-informed care? Kate, we got one. Yay. Ashley, yay.
I have two. I just have problems finding my hand raise.
Okay. Does anyone want to share their kind of definition of trauma-informed care? That's okay. That's what I'm here for. So trauma-informed care is orienting yourself to your work in a way that acknowledges that almost all of us have experienced trauma. And even as kids, most of us have experienced traumatic experiences, including historical and intergenerational trauma around racism and oppression. Knowing that, accepting that, and moving forward with your work in a way that cares for people around that. So instead of making assumptions about the way people show up, to acknowledge that they're showing up the way they're showing up for a reason. If someone shows up to your clinic and they don't want to give you any information, they clearly don't trust you, they don't want to be in that space, it might be because they've had a lot of experiences, a lot of bad experiences, a lot of traumatic experiences, because in their community, the feeling of mistrust, the well-founded feeling of mistrust has been transmitted for generations. And they might not trust the medical system or the healthcare system. They might not trust white folks. They might not, if you're a male, they might not trust men because of things that have happened to them and had an impact on them. And it's not personal. It's just the life that they've lived. Ashley says, operating through the lens of compassion and in a given profession, acknowledging trauma, past experience. Yep, absolutely spot on. Yeah, so acknowledging that and doing our best to show up in a caring, compassionate way, where given the position of power that most of us hold in our systems, we can show up and do our best to meet people where they're at. So we talked about this. The piece here that I didn't mention is to actively avoid re-traumatizing folks. So that's really important part of trauma-informed care. So when we're talking about racism and internalized racism, we really need to make sure we're doing a good job to make sure our space is warm and friendly in a way that's culturally responsive, to not enact any microaggressions, and to certainly make sure that our systems and policies aren't going to re-traumatize folks either. So trauma-informed care is based on these 6 principles. The most important being safety, because trauma is all about the times in our lives when we were unsafe. Trust and transparency, peer support, collaboration, empowerment, and being humble and responsive. So acknowledging that we don't know all of the things and that we have things to learn from other people and other communities. So rather than talk about the definition of all of these principles, I want to just use some examples to kind of integrate the flavor of trauma-informed care. So when we talk about other people, when we talk about ourselves, the way we interact with others, the way we design our spaces and programs, and the way we care for ourselves. I want to just throw this out to you guys. Does anyone have examples of maybe spaces or policies or experiences you've had that weren't trauma-informed?
I mean, I can think of something more generally I've seen in terms of not incorporating the populations that you're serving into the initial discussions in terms of program development.
Do you want to talk specifically about that, Kate?
I'm just thinking about in terms of even, let's see, like our medical interpretation program specifically. I feel like we assumed patients would like someone in person from the community there, opposed to now we also have available options of professional medical interpreters who are not in the community, which I feel like really helps in terms of a lot of people feeling more comfortable during appointments. And having access to those medical interpretation services and not feeling like they're going to run into someone in the community since we're such a small community.
Yeah, that's a great example in terms of policy. And the way that that shows up in your clinical spaces. Yeah, so, and you talk about the way you responded to that. So kind of acknowledging that, you know, trust might be hard for a lot of folks in the community because of experiences that they've had, and giving them some different options that are more trauma-informed. Yeah. I want to talk about another one that I've experienced as a therapist. So, you know, I work with mostly teens and their parents, and a lot of times, you know, the teens I work with have a lot of trauma. They often come in with, you know, they're having problems at school. Their parents are upset that they're not helping out at home. They're getting in trouble. And their parents are like, I don't know what's wrong with my kid. Falta de respeto. No tienen ganas para nada. And it's kind of this feeling like fix it, like, you know, do what you do, therapist. But in my work with teens, I almost always want to involve parents because I get 1 hour with kids and parents get all the hours with kids. And a lot of what kids are going through is usually based on what's happening at home. And so I want to have conversations with parents, talk about how they're parenting their bicultural kids, And a lot of times parents don't really want to talk to me, or they'll just tell me, sí, doctora. I'm not a doctor, but that's how I'm perceived, I think. And just kind of tell me, I think, what I want to hear. And when I first started working with these kids, it made me feel offended. Like, why doesn't this parent want to talk to me? Like, why aren't kind of placing the blame on them? Why aren't they honest? Why aren't, because that's a value that I hold dear. Why aren't they upfront with me? And it took me some time to kind of realize that for them, one, they have this deep distrust of systems because they've been through a lot. They've been oppressed a lot. They feel like if they give me any information, I'm probably going to use it against them because that's happened before to them and to their families and to their community. But two, that, I don't have the same respect for them as a parent that they're expecting that I should. Also, I look young. I'm not as young as I look, but that I need to be more respectful with them and their interactions. And so instead of kind of placing blame on them for not interacting with me in the way that I want or the way that I expect, trying to realize that they've been through a lot of things and they have different cultural values than I do, and integrating that to approach them with an attitude of curiosity about, why is it difficult to talk about these things with me, and following their lead on that and looking for the strengths in them as a parent and in their culture. That's helped me be a lot more effective with parents in my personal interactions. So if we go back to this last slide, trying to build that trust and transparency, a sense of safety, collaboration, and really empowering parents to tell me what they need, what are the solutions to their problems at home, and being humble and curious and responsive in those sessions. I wish we had more time to talk about this, you guys. We're almost out of time. So I've really tried to incorporate this idea as we've been talking, but cultural humility is really different than cultural competence. Cultural competence is an older term that a lot of folks still use that implies that we can get to a place where we are competent and we have all the knowledge and skills necessary to work within a community. But as I've mentioned, communities are so complex and multifaceted and diverse, and we will never be competent in another person's culture. And so instead, we try to embrace the attitude of cultural humility, that always we are striving to learn from and with and understand people who are different from us. Oh, there it is. So this is really based in a commitment to self-reflection and a desire to fix power imbalances within our interpersonal relationships, but also hopefully in a more systemic way in our agencies and our healthcare systems. And we definitely need to acknowledge that we can't do that work unless we're in partnership with the people and groups who we are trying to advocate for. Meaningful partnership. So just to kind of put this out as a last thought, I want to invite everyone on this call to just take 30 seconds to take a deep breath and get centered in your most wise place. And I want to ask you, each of you, to just think, what is one thing that you can do, whether it's to self-reflect, maybe it's an action item, maybe it's a connection that you want to make, something you want to learn. But what is one thing that you can do to begin integrating a trauma-informed and culturally responsive approach into the place where you work? So let's just all take one moment to reflect on that. Would anybody like to share any reflections? too scary. Okay, that's okay. We're out of time anyway. I just want to say thank you to everybody for sharing this hour, your lunch break with me. And yes, Ashley, you're going to read Body Keeps the Score. That's wonderful. If anybody has any questions or you want to talk more about this topic, my email is right there in the presentation. And I just wish you all the best of luck going forward in building that cultural humility and trauma-informed approach. And I hope you all have a beautiful spring day.
And thank you.